Welcome to the grand finale of our Faculty Scholarship Series for academic year 2022-2023. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Ryan W. Booth, a former faculty member at Heritage University, who is now a faculty member, as you may notice, at Washington State University. So let's give Ryan a round of applause and let him do any additional academic introductions of himself he would like. Bravo. Take it away, Ryan.
I don't know that there's anything academic. You can, if you're really dying to know all that stuff, you can go to our website at the history department here at WSU to learn more about that. I will say I cut my teeth at Heritage University, and for that I'm forever grateful. And I always feel like whenever Heritage asks for something, I am more than happy to help because it was such a formational experience. And the team, particularly with Mary James and the SILT folks, I was talking before we started, SILT saved my life at Heritage. Those folks I had never taught before I came to Heritage. And so I was sort of on the fly learning how to do my job, building the plane as we were flying, which is quite an experience, but I'm really, really glad for that. And the lessons I learned there continue to inform my work even to the present day. So thank you for this opportunity. I guess I would like to start with, so this person, James Sanks Brisbin, Forgotten Wordsmith and Warrior, comes out of a research project I started as a Bradley Fellow at the Montana Historical Society. So I spent a couple of different times, both in the middle of the winter and then during the summer in Helena, Montana, looking at these papers, which you can see a sample of Brisbane's writing here. The Montana Historical Society has about 2 linear feet of material covering James Sanks Brisbin's life from about 1853 to 1892. He was born in 1837, but they have his adult life materials there. And James Sanks Brisbin had an opinion about everything. So this is the beauty of this collection, of only which we'll get just a tiny sampling of. But he had opinions about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the death of Edgar Allan Poe, the Lincoln assassination, cattle raising. He wrote letters to the editor. He was sort of that grumpy old man who's always writing letters to the editor. So he gave 4th of July speeches all over the West, mostly because of his Civil War experience. He is probably one of the more candid, funny, and very strong moral compass individuals I have ever had the opportunity to study. He's an incredibly gifted writer, and his language is really something that hooked me and prompted further interest in his work. And sadly, partly because he was maybe a little bit disliked by some of his fellow officers, because we'll look at some reasons why that might be. They just sort of dismissed him. They called him Grasshopper Jim, which is because of his interest in the American West and his boosterism of trying to get people to move west. And so they sort of looked down their noses at him for his interest in sort of popular literature. And so who was James Sanks Brisbin? He was born on May 23rd, 1837. He attended a school. He's from Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. And the Boalsburg Academy, where he went to school, was one of the first publicly funded school systems in the state. And it was also unique because it actually had a scholarly curriculum for public students instead of just a trade school, which most of these public schools had been up to that point. He received a college education. He taught school. He studied law, but he never finished his law degree. And then he went on to edit a weekly newspaper called the Center Democrat, which was published in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. He enlisted in the Penns Valley Cadets, which was a unit of the Pennsylvania militia. By 1859, he was elected their captain, and by 1860, he enlisted in a regular Pennsylvania regiment, and on April 26, 1861, was appointed a second lieutenant in the 1st U.S. Cavalry. So just from that brief little section, I hope you get a sense that Brisbin was a busy guy, even as a young man. He was was involved in a variety of activities, and he very rarely let the grass grow underneath his feet. In a way, I think one of the things that we have to think about in the life of somebody born in 1837, this picture on the right is really this moral map of the United States, which is about, the states that had enslaved people and those that had abolished slavery to the north. This was an issue that consumed U.S. society, and we don't know a lot about Brisbane's early life, but we do know that the area that he came from was largely Irish immigrants who leaned Democrat, which at that point in time, the Democratic Party was closely associated with Southerners as well as being pro-slavery. And so he is a little bit of an aberration because in the 1850s, Brisbin is one of the early Republicans. So he lives in this democratically controlled central Pennsylvania area, but he chooses to join with the newly formed Republican Party. And so one of the connections he has is to the fellow on the left, who's Simon Cameron, who was a Pennsylvania senator. He started his life as a Democrat and then became a Republican in the 1850s. He was a persistent opponent of slavery. He was also one of the political bosses of Pennsylvania. He was incredibly corrupt. Nobody's perfect. And he was also Abraham Lincoln's first Secretary of War. And he gets embroiled in a political crisis while he's Secretary of War that ends up leading to him being reassigned, or Lincoln makes him ambassador to Russia, which is sort of an interesting way of getting rid of a problem in that. So, but he becomes sort of the political boss patron of Brisbane and helps him get those commissions in the regular army and helps him get his way into the Civil War. The other thing that Brisbane is deeply involved in, because of that journalist background and because he's a newspaperman, he ends up engaging in lots of public debates via the newspapers, which were the major way of getting your voice out in the 1850s and early into the 1860s. And he ends up in this very public debate with Governor John Letcher, who's the governor of Virginia and very pro-slavery. And they end up writing these back and forth letters that get covered by national media across the country. And so they debate back and forth with each other in all of this. So by the time James Sanks Brisbin is in the Army in the Civil War, he's a known person. People have heard his name because of all of this, which is interesting to me, partly because nowadays we don't remember him at all, really. So if you ever want to go to a resource, this book written by Hammersley is the 19th century who's who of anybody serving in the U.S. military. So it's a great resource for finding officers and where they've been and what they've done in the Army. And so you can briefly see that he is one of the few people who it's interesting what it says and what it doesn't say about his service. So what does it say? If you look at this, it's telling us that James Sanks Brisbin served all 4 years of the Civil War, which in and of itself is an incredible accomplishment, that he was there from the very first battle at Bull Run until the end of the war. He served in the Army during that whole time and saw some major battle throughout his career. So it tells you that. It also tells you that he was wounded So he did not emerge from the war unscathed. He saw battle and was wounded at the Battle of First Bull Run. And he also was involved in the Peninsular campaigns with General McClellan in the Army of the Potomac. And he was at probably the classic cavalry battle in the Shenandoah at Brandy Station. So he saw some major action, and he was throughout the war. The other thing that, if you look through some of these descriptions of the battles as well, it also tells you that he commanded U.S. colored troops. It doesn't say that in this, but if you are looking at some of the clues in here, he also earned some accolades for his service. So things like the brevet in there are given because of his services in battle and the fact that he is promoted based on that. And then after the war, he has a brief moment of retirement and thinks he's going to go back to private life. But then he re-enlists in the regular army and goes out west. So it tells you all of that if you look at these, this couple of paragraphs here. What doesn't it say? It doesn't tell us much about his service during Reconstruction, which is interesting. He spent his time mostly in Louisiana during Reconstruction, and so that's one of that we'll talk some more about that in a bit. It also does not mention the fact that he was a celebrated author after the war. So he wrote a variety of books. So so the fact that he was a best-selling author isn't mentioned here. He also was at some pretty major battles in the American West, ones that include Beecher's Island, but probably the one most people would be familiar with, the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was actually there. So there's some of those things. And then it also overlooks the person of his wife, Mary Jane Wagner, or he referred to her as Jenny. It ignores that relationship between those two. And that, I think, is important to his life as well. She was the one who was there for him throughout his life. Okay, let's just briefly talk about this. So he was at the First Battle of Bull Run. He was a second lieutenant in the 1st U.S. Cavalry, the old U.S. 1st, and he served under General Henselman's division. He was wounded in both the side and the arm at this battle, which, of course, if you know anything about the First Battle of Bull Run, was just really chaos, and it wasn't. It was just. It didn't go to anybody's plan in all of this, and it's really, in many ways, just a draw. Although, it really is an unclear battle. But you can see Henselman listed here in the map, and that's sort of where he was during the Battle of Bull Run. Okay, let me get into some really fun stuff, which is Mary Jane or Jenny, and so she was this part of his life, and they had 8 kids together in their marriage. And there's these letters that exist between the two of them that are really treasure troves of information, partly because they're very personal. I mean, they're personal, and they're also giving you some information about the Civil War. And these letters, I think, are particularly interesting for historians because, let's be honest, historians love to read other people's mail. We're all really gossips. We're professional gossips. That's what we do. So, we thrive on this stuff. So let me read a little bit of some excerpts from his life, from his letters back and forth. He reports, "My dear wife, I am still here. I was all ready to start away, but got orders to remain just when I was starting. My troops are gone. I will go sometime tonight. Captain Claflin is now in command of my troops. The army is moving. Boots and saddles has just sounded in the camps of the 1st and 2nd Dragoons. General Burnside's will move sometime during the night. Camps are disappearing hourly, and troops are taking up the line of their march." So that sounds what you might expect from a Civil War letter. He's also talking about the artillery is going in by going by in long lines. 2 staff officers of General Barry's staff have just been here. I must go and see my friend, the Baron von Hammerstein, for whom I'm indebted to him for the fine command I now have. If he had not interfered on my behalf, I should have been probably arrested. I will try to write to you tomorrow, but may have no chance. Keep up your spirits. All will go well. I will come out safe. Oh, my dear wife, if I could only kiss your sweet lips once, I would die content. Pray for me. God bless you. I kiss you in my imagination. So, there's some mentions of these folks. There was a large contingent of Europeans who had come to participate in the Civil War. So this Lieutenant Colonel von Hammerstein is one of these Europeans who's come to get in on the action, which is amazing that, foreign folks, but I think we see this, in Ukraine today, that there are folks who are willing to make a sacrifice in these war efforts. And so there's some of that. And let's see. He also is incredibly jealous as well, and sort of offers advice to his wife too. So he says, "Now if mother and you can get along, I will let the whole matter drop and the past be past and forgotten. You should not allow your temper to get the better of your judgment. Your temper, like your passion, often leads you to do wrong things. My dear wife, be a good girl and do not give me any more trouble." So he's writing these things as he's in the middle of the war in all of this. But, he's sort of patting her on the head in this. You'll see this and you'll see a little bit of a different change as they get west, partly because they're also older in all of this. And you'll see a change in this relationship from their early marriage, as they move forward on the time continuum. So one of the other things that we have to say during this period is that on March 1st, 1864, he was appointed colonel of the 5th Colored Cavalry. He went on to, make the long list to lieutenant colonel, major general in all of this. And during this time, he was, overseeing these units of U.S. Colored Cavalry. So this is one of the things that changes over the course of the war as the war progresses. Lincoln and the rest of the Lincoln administration began to put together the idea that African Americans are clamoring for a role in this, and they are asking to be used as soldiers in the Civil War, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in late 1862, but becomes law by January 1st, 1863. The Lincoln administration begins incorporating Black troops in the Civil War. So nearly 20 to 25% of U.S. forces by the end of the war will be African Americans, which is one of those things I think we have forgotten over time, that this was a significant role of African Americans in the Civil War, and I think that's one of those things that we have sort of forgotten over time. And what did that look like? For these troops, and we'll talk a little bit about these two places. So there's the Battle of Saltville and the Battle of Marion, and they take place at different points in the war. And so one is in October and the other's in December of 1864. And so you can tell Saltville was important to the Confederacy because the major thing that came out of this place in southwestern Virginia is salt, which was the major way to be able to preserve food in the 19th century. And so this was a major place for this. And so the United States decided that if they could knock out, some of these places, they might be able to lessen the resolve of the Confederacy in the Civil War. So they send Brisbin and his troops to Saltville to try to take this out. What happens at Saltville, though, is one of these horrific events which began to happen in the latter part of the war. The Confederacy said that if they caught or captured African American soldiers, in uniform, that they would either put them immediately into slavery or kill them on sight. And so, African Americans, as they enlisted in the cause, for the United States, knew that going into this, that they were putting their lives on the line for this in ways that white soldiers were not. And so this at Saltville, the U.S. had to retreat from a position as the Confederacy sort of fought back, and they had set up a makeshift hospital camp or hospital tent where there were about 50 of these African Americans who had been injured. And as they pulled back, they didn't have enough time to, evacuate the wounded. The wounded were captured by the Confederates and immediately executed on the spot, as they lay in their hospital beds. And so this was one of those examples of this sort of being put in action. And then later, they were sent back to sort of retake Saltville, as well as the neighboring town of Marion. Marion had an ironworks in it. And so those two things end up kind of being important in Brisbane's sort of interest, but also one of his speeches has been taken in his sort of rallying of the troops has been, become something that teachers use in their curriculum. So this is part of that Civil War service. As he's getting ready to leave the Army, he issues order number 43. So this is after the war's ended. He's sort of thinking back, and he's telling the U.S. colored troops that are under his command on April 16th, 1866. He gives this speech, which you can see both in written out in his handwriting, but also in as I've typed it out here. And he is basically saying that, this war that has been fought is for both groups, and what happened to you and this flag is a representation. It floats over both you and me, and we have an obligation to it. And so, you are as much a part of, the United States as anybody else. And he also says, that he says in this order, when you black men enlisted, you were promised freedom and protection as a condition. On the 18th of December, 1865, a requisite number of states having ratified a constitutional amendment forever abolishing slavery in the United States, the Secretary of State issued a proclamation declaring it to be the law of the land. You are therefore legally as free as the white man of this country, and it is your duty to yourselves and your children to maintain your freedom. And so he, continues to sort of say that what has happened, which fits with his overall trajectory in his life as sort of one of these early Republicans, and sort of following in this, in that vein of thinking. He's talking about equality in all of this as well. He also manages to debate during this same period. I don't know if you know the figure of Raphael Semmes. We don't think of him much anymore, but he was a Confederate admiral, part of the Confederate Navy. He also edited, after the war, a New Orleans newspaper. And Semmes immediately says, all of the problems of the South that are happening are the fault of the black soldiers. So the looting, the rioting, all of the crime that is happening is the direct result of black troops in New Orleans. And Brisbin writes back to him in this newspaper, we who are their friends by the help of God and a radical Congress will in good time, in a legal way, properly punish you and all their enemies and the enemies of the Republic. And in the meantime, the Negroes will be quiet, orderly, and industrious citizens. And then he also goes on to say that, the best way to treat former Confederate officers and any of the elected leaders in the Confederacy is that they should be treated to rope reconstruction, a euphemism for being hanged as traitors, and that should be the only proper punishment for their service in the Confederacy. So he continues this sort of back and forth with Sanks in this, and I think represents a particular view which of those who were in service during the Civil War had opinions. They had very strong feelings about the service that they provided for the country and were not in a mood for conciliation after the war, which some after the war began to look at this and sort of have read it in a different way. But these folks who saw battle in the Civil War, I think were a lot more passionate about these things than we, reading it from today, looking back, think about it in all of this. Okay, so Brisbin does, after the Civil War, manage to make his way west, and so he arrives with his wife and children at Fort D.A. Russell, which is located near Cheyenne, Wyoming. And he writes it in 1866 in some very colorful terms. So here's a quote. Quote, "It was Sunday when we arrived in the straggling little village of Cheyenne with its canvas houses. Sunday is a great day in new towns out west, and horse races, shows, and gambling was in full progress. From almost every other house along the streets came the clink of dice and money and the songs of half-drunken men. Houses of prostitution stood open to the street, and half-naked women could be seen within, their bloated and painted faces almost hideous when exposed to the light of day." And so what he's describing here is a hell on wheels. It's these towns as the Transcontinental Railroad is being constructed. There are these little towns that spring up along the route of the railroad that are just freewheeling, boozy, places that are full of gambling, whiskey parlors, women of ill repute, as well as horse racing and all sorts of things that out in the East would have been strongly sort of frowned upon, but out West, all of this stuff was happening, and it was honestly, really encouraged in many ways. One of the other things that he writes about is that he compares some of his experiences of the Civil War with his time out West. And one of the things that he describes is, my Army experience had been associated with Fortress Monroe and the great earth walls that built by rebels during the war. I confessed I expected to see Fort Russell, a high-walled place with gates, embrasures, and bastions. Imagine then my surprise at beholding a few buildings scattered about on the open plain with only a flag flying over them for protection to indicate the place was he puts it in air quotes, a fort. And it's one of these quotes that you can hear the disappointment in his voice. He's thinking, I'm going to go out to this fort and it's going to be this big, with the high walls and the sorts of stuff that you imagine a fort to look like. And it's just this place with a few ratty buildings and a flagpole, and this is a fort, and he is shocked by his new posting. One of the things that also happens during this time is that he is, as I mentioned, his wife joins him and his children, which is not typical for many of the officers in the Army out West. Most of the wives typically stayed out East. And so the fact that she moved with him is very interesting. And so one of the things that also happens while she's out there is that she did not want to be separated from him. And so she went along with him as he, went out on maneuvers, and as he went, out, out into hostile territory. And so he she would prefer living, he wrote, she would prefer a tent or hut to separation. His General Christopher C. Auger, issued an order in 1868 that said that he did not want the wives of officers out on expeditions. So let's take a minute to think about that. He issued an order forbidding wives to go on expeditions. Generals are not in the habit of issuing orders unless there's a problem, sort of like universities issuing memos. So the fact that he issued this order means that there were women along on these expeditions in the American West, which I think is an important thing to think about, that this is not just dudes on dudes out west, but that these were actually, that there were women involved in these, in some of these actions in the West. And that seems to me an area that we need to look at more. But she went with Brisbin anyway. She ignored the order. So she went out and she Brisbin built her a rude home made out of pine poles, dirt floors, blankets, where the doors should have been. And in 1869-70, the general came for a visit. So the family went into hiding. And everyone was forbidden to tell the general that Mary Jane Jenny was there with the kids. And so by the afternoon, she emerged from hiding when the men had departed to go fishing for trout. And so she thought the coast was clear. She's going to go down to the river to get water. And she found the general reading a book on the sides of this creek. And he was flabbergasted at the presence of this woman out on this camp. And he asked, "Hello, where did you come from?" And she answered, and the general apparently started scolding her for disobeying his orders, and she responded very positively, quote, "You can command my husband, General, but please do remember that you do not command me. I do not belong to the military service. I am a woman," end quote. And so, but to sort of smooth over matters, she prepared a meal for the general. And by the end of the night, the general had forgiven any of these things. And she remained in the Wind River country for the remainder of Brisbane's time in the field. So I think that gives you a sense that how this relationship between Jenny and Jim had changed over the years in all of this. They had become a real partnership for each other. Okay, the other thing that I think is interesting is that James Sanks Brisbin was also in the proverbial room where it happened on this steamer, which you see pictured here. It's called the Far West. And at the Far West, General Alfred Terry outlined his plan for how he was going to approach what would become the Battle of Little Bighorn. And he outlined a plan that was going to be this encirclement, or what we might call a pincher movement, around the coalition of forces of Lakota, Cheyenne, and other tribes that were arrayed in modern-day Montana. And so another person who was present at this was Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer. So they were all in this meeting as they outlined this. And Brisbin outlines and blames Custer for his vainglory and everything that happened at Little Bighorn. And so he also says that that this would have been an Army victory if General Terry's plan had been followed. And one of the other places he also writes, which is Brisbane's just sort of utter honesty in these things. He also refers to Custer as a, quote, insufferable ass, end quote, in all of this. So the person of James Sanks Brisbin is, I think, is an important person to figure. And as I mentioned, he is also during this time writing these books. So Belden the White Chief in 1870, The Beef Bonanza, where he is sort of writing about how to get rich quick on cattle in the American West. And he also, because of his Civil War service, kind of holds the flag for James Garfield, which is an interesting story in and of itself. Another person we don't think of much anymore, but was a great hero for many who had served in the Civil War. So he wrote these books. He continued to sort of kind of become a booster for the American West, which also explains why his papers are in the Montana Historical Society, because he's sort of writing about these places. Now, he has some really amazing parts of him, but I think like everybody else, he has some parts that are sort of seem out of touch. So, on the one hand, he seems like a very enlightened 19th century person in terms of his sensibilities about equality, and his, choosing service with the Black troops during and after the Civil War, but then, the blind spot for him is sometimes Native people. So his, insistence on people moving west, he doesn't seem to connect why these wars are happening between settlers and, indigenous people in the West. His insistence on move west, is displacing indigenous people. And so he just never seems to see those things, as interrelated. And that, that seems to be one of those things about him. He also becomes a speaker throughout he's often invited to 4th of July celebrations, and he gives variations of that speech that you saw about, this flag and sort of the service of U.S. Colored troops. And then later he talks about the Buffalo Soldiers, who are also in the American West. So he is holding the line on this sort of what they termed after the war, the radical Republican agenda, which was sort of a fully embracing the vision of Abraham Lincoln, which was that we really ought to live up to the words of the Declaration of Independence. Until we can honestly say all people are created equal, this American experiment is not complete. And so James Sanks Brisbin continually draws back, to kind of that Lincoln sense of, this project is undone until we can honestly look people in the face and say that everyone here is equal. And so this sense of, is sort of the mission of his, later years as an elder. And to me, it seems to really undercut many of the importance of his life and who he was. And so the people who write about him as only as Grasshopper Jim, that sort of sense of him as kind of this nobody. He only volunteered for service. He was never a West Point graduate. That his service was not as good as some of these other folks who had all of that, the credentials and all of that, I think really misses the point, as well as sort of the importance of a person like him in the West. And for me, I'm really glad that I had the chance to sort of look at his life, to remember this remarkable man and officer, as well as, and to try to sort of recapture some of these things. And I think it's time for us to give him another look. And to begin to look at some of the lives of officers who are similar to him. So with that, I thank you. And I don't know if if you have any questions or if there's time for that.
Yes, there is time, Jim. We could go ahead and just take us back to, or I guess, Ryan, if you want to quit share screen, then we could see all the people in the room for chatting about your talk.
Yes.
So we had one comment in the chat from Dr. Pretty Paint, which was about the situation of the Buffalo Soldiers hunting tribal people and then being paid money for their scalps. Do you want to expand a little bit on that topic?
So Dr. Pretty Paint is not wrong in that assumption, or in that statement. I shouldn't say assumption; it's a statement. So yes, this is the complicated, contested nature of what's happening in the American West. And I would also add, so my research is on the U.S. Indian Scouts. So this was not just isolated to African Americans and the Buffalo Soldiers, but these were Native Americans themselves who were participating in this, in what we call the U.S. Indian Wars. And so that also adds, I think, a level of complexity to this. Folks who are Native people fighting other Native people. And that, I think, is, it's complicated. Historians often like to say that, but it is one of those things, which is an ancient thing through human history of the sort of divide and conquer, find ways to sort of break people up and to find grievances, and often imagined, not real ones, and to use that as a way to foment war. Since almost the beginning of human history, war has been part of this, and for that, I think, which is one of those things that I think, which is what interests me in all of this, is that sort of war also manages to give you a window into a world in ways that cuts across lots of different, geography, gender, religion, all these different things. That gives you a window into these worlds where it's one of those things that sort of cuts through everything. And I think that for me makes it infinitely interesting to look at, as well as ugly, horrific, and hopefully at some point in time, I still have the hope and belief that through studying things like history and some of these folks, that we can maybe at some point get better. That humanity can do better. Otherwise, why else? I don't know. I might just hang up my hat and do something else. But I still have that belief in me that we do have a chance to make a difference, and people can make better choices. And so I hold on to that. But yeah.
This was a fascinating presentation, so thank you for sharing with us. I'm wondering if you have any sort of voice to provide for the troops that he commanded, or the speeches that he made, particularly to the freed people and the soldiers of the Ninth and so forth.
Yeah, there's that I haven't really looked at, and looking just at his papers, of course, you're just getting his perspective on this. But another part of this project would be to sort of see what were the experiences of these soldiers that were under his command, and what were they saying about these things, and what sort of memory exists from that. That seems to me the next step of this. So still early in this process. I've got to get my dissertation turned into a book first, so I can get tenure, and then. But after that, I really want to come back to this, and I want to look at this history. So, the other part of it, I will admit, I really, really want to know more about these different groups, and to be able to learn more about that literature on the U.S. colored troops as well as the Buffalo Soldiers. As I was doing my research, I was all about Indian Scouts. I just had to you have to put the blinders on, and I just could not. The problem with archival research, at least for me, is that there's just so many interesting things, and you're like, God, this is a good story. I want to know, but you just have to, otherwise you'll be there forever. But I think you got a preview today of what my future writing project is to cover this some more.
Well, make sure you retain the movie rights for your book.
Yeah. I think a perspective from Jenny would be the best.
Very much so, indeed.
So I think we have time for another question. And Kathleen, you're not muted. Did you have something you wanted to contribute?
Well, I guess I had two two little comments. One you just reminded me of, Ryan, his wife, Jenny was her name. Is that right?
Yeah, Mary Jane.
Is there more information about her? I'm just really struck by her talking back to that general and telling him, I'm not under your authority. Maybe another aspect of interesting research would be more about the history of women who had the courage to do those kind of, and what difference it made, if it made any difference. And then the other comment that I had was very similar to what's already been said, but his research background is in cross-cultural things, but a lot of history. So I've had that same feeling before. You find somebody that you think, wow, this guy or this gal is really a hero. She did this and this and this. And Brisbin certainly had a lot of courage to stand up for the colored troops and to take their rights and roles. But then you learn that, yes, but he was on the other, he didn't recognize when he said, you have to recognize everyone as equal. Yeah, but he didn't apply that to Indigenous people. And so the other aspect of doing history is finding out, well, nobody's a saint. Let's put it that way. And I don't know if you want to comment any more on that, but it's realistic, and I think it's helpful for us as faculty to thinking of, be sure that the students get to see that, because then it makes them think in their own lives. None of us are saints either. We have our good side and our bad side. So you learn from history in that way. Those are just thoughts.
Well, thank you, Sister Kathleen, for being here. And, I was talking about, before you got here, the great thanks for the experience to be able to teach at Heritage, that you helped get me there. And that, I'm forever grateful to Heritage and the work that you did. I wouldn't be where I am without you. So there's that. The other thing, I would say, I think this is the thing about history. Unlike some of you other folks, I know that there's a variety of disciplines here. History is one of those things that's 2020, because we're always looking in the rearview mirror. We're always driving backwards or whatever, because, so we can look at things and sort of, some of the other things you're looking forward and you're sort of planning these things out and maybe not, knowing exactly what's ahead. But so we have an even more critical eye as we look back at the past, which I think is okay. And that I think we have to, if we're ever going to use some of the lessons from the past to help us in the present, it seems to me that these are things, we have to do. And I am constantly aware of wondering, as a historian, thinking about what am I doing right now, like on today, March 28th, 2023, what am I doing now that somebody 100 years from now will look back at me and say, what, my God, why were they so dumb? Like, how did they not see that this was, such an issue? And I don't know what that might be. It might be climate change or something else, but, why didn't they see this? And so, but I think that's the thing I think I take with me from a humanities education, is that, this hope that we can learn. That's the purpose of education, is to hopefully learn lessons that we can apply to today and make for a brighter future, which is always those things that, I have incredible respect for all of you at Heritage for what you're doing and the work that you do day in, day out, because you are the folks who are probably making some of the biggest impact on this state and the world. And for that, my hat's off to all of you who are there making those differences. So thank you.
So that seems like a fabulous way to end this talk, the speaker honoring the audience. But Ryan, thank you so much. It is our delight to have a scholarly, carefully focused talk today. We are so grateful to you. And anytime you're driving by, please visit us.
I'll do my best.